I still remember the exact second my phone rang that night. It was 11:47 p.m. The blue light cut through the dark of my apartment, like a warning I should have heeded. The name on the screen made my stomach drop. Mrs. Claire Harrington, my boss's wife. We had never spoken outside those polished company events, Christmas. Parties filled with forced laughter and the smell of expensive candles. Summer garden parties where everyone pretended the air wasn't thick with unspoken things. Claire always stood beside Richard like a carefully placed sculpture, elegant, controlled, the kind of woman who made silence feel deliberate. I was the reliable assistant who stayed late, fixed the presentations, and kept my head down. I almost ignored the call. Something in my chest tightened instead, a quiet, instinctive dread. I answered. Her voice came through, stripped of every polished layer I had ever heard. Get here in 10 minutes, or he won't survive. The line went dead. I sat frozen on the edge of my bed, phone still pressed to my ear, even though there was only silence now. The ordinary sounds of my apartment, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic, the tick of the wall clock, suddenly felt too loud. My hands were already shaking as I grabbed my keys. Richard Harrington, my boss, the man whose corner office overlooked the city like a private kingdom. The man who had, over the past year, started staying later whenever I stayed late. The man whose quiet compliments had begun to feel warmer than professional courtesy. I had told myself it was nothing. I had told myself I was careful. I had told myself I would never cross the line. But the way my pulse hammered as I threw a coat over my pajamas told a different story. I drove through the empty streets with the windows cracked open. The city looked different at that hour streetlights smeared across wet asphalt. The occasional distant siren, the feeling that the whole world was holding its breath with me. Every red light felt personal. Every empty intersection felt like a warning I was choosing to ignore. Their house sat high on the hill, every window glowing as if the place itself was awake and waiting. The front gate stood open. The front door was unlocked. I stepped inside. The air smelled of polished wood, Claire's signature perfume, and something sharper underneath iron and fear. And then I saw him. Richard lay on the living room floor, one hand pressed hard against his side. Blood had soaked through his white shirt in a dark, spreading bloom that had already reached the edge of the expensive rug. His breathing was shallow. His eyes found mine the moment I entered, and for a second, the rest of the world disappeared. Claire stood a few feet away, phone still in her hand, face pale but eyes unnervingly clear. She was still in her silk robe, barefoot, as if she had been interrupted in the middle of an ordinary evening. "You came," she said, almost in a whisper. I dropped to my knees beside him. The carpet was soft under my hands, already warm where the blood had reached. "What happened?" "We need an ambulance. Already called," Claire answered. Her voice was steady in a way that felt wrong. "But I needed you here first." Richard's fingers brushed my wrist, weak, trembling. He tried to speak. Only a broken sound came out. Claire knelt on the other side of him, her robe pooling around her like spilled water. She looked at me the way a woman looks at a locked door she has finally decided to open. "He was leaving me," she said softly. "For you." The words did not arrive as sound. They arrived as impact-sharp total, rearranging everything inside my chest. I stared at her, then at him, the man whose late-night conversations had started to feel like secrets. The man who had once almost said something on a rainy evening and then swallowed it with a careful laugh. The man I had allowed myself, in the quietest corners of my mind, to wonder about. "I never asked for that," I managed. "I know," Claire said. "You didn't ask. That's what made you dangerous." She reached into the pocket of her robe and pulled out a second phone, the one I had never known existed. She unlocked it with a code she clearly already knew and turned. The screen toward me. Messages, drafts, words he had written and deleted. Words that named me. Words that spoke of leaving, of starting over, of a life that did not include the perfect wife who stood beside him at every public event. Richard's eyes closed for a moment. When they opened again, there was something like apology in them and something colder underneath. Fear, outside. The first distant wail of sirens began to rise. Claire's voice stayed low, almost gentle. I need you to understand something before they take him away. Everything you think you know about this marriage is a story he wrote for both of us. And you, whether you meant to or not, became the final chapter he was trying to rewrite. I looked down at the blood on my hands, at the man whose attention had once felt like warmth, and felt the first deep crack open inside the life I thought I understood. That night did not end when the paramedics arrived and lifted him onto a stretcher. It was only the moment the real story began, the moment I realized the danger was never just the knife on the floor. Asterisk, they took Richard away under flashing lights. I stayed in the hospital waiting room until the sky outside turned the pale gray of early morning. Claire sat across from me the entire time, her posture perfect, even in a silk robe and bare feet, as if composure itself was the only armor she had left. When the doctor finally told us the wound was serious but not fatal, a kitchen knife, an argument that had turned physical, a moment of rage she claimed she immediately regretted, Claire only nodded. No tears, no drama, just a quiet acceptance that felt heavier than any outburst. I should have left then. Instead, I stayed. Over the following days, the truth did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way cold seeps into a house slowly, through every small opening, until you realize the entire place has changed temperature. Claire invited me for coffee 3 days later. We met in a quiet cafe far from the office, far from anyone who might recognize either of us. She placed a thin black folder on the table between us and opened it without ceremony. Screenshots, bank records, deleted message drafts recovered from the cloud. A second phone's entire history. Richard had been planning to leave. Not in a sudden burst of passion, but with the same careful precision he used in business. He had moved money. He had researched apartments in another city. He had written messages to me that he never sent, messages that spoke of freedom, of finally being seen, of a future that did not include the woman who had spent 15 years protecting his image. I read them with shaking hands. Every late night in the office came back to me in a new light. The way he would loosen his tie and talk about how tired he was of performing. The way his eyes would linger a second too long. The rainy evening when he had started to say something and then stopped, laughing it off as exhaustion. I had told myself it was harmless. I had told myself I was professional. I had told myself the warmth in my chest was only gratitude for being valued. I had been lying to myself as carefully as he had been lying to both of us. I found these the night of the argument, Claire said quietly. He came home late. I asked where he had been. He said the office. I already knew he hadn't been there. When I showed him the phone, he didn't deny it. He just looked at me like I was the one who had broken something sacred. She paused, stirring her untouched coffee. I picked up the knife because I wanted him to feel even a fraction of the cut he had been making for years. I didn't mean for it to go that far. But once the blood was on the floor, I realized something. I didn't want him dead. I wanted the truth to live. I sat across from her, the weight of the folder pressing against my palms, and felt something inside me fracture, not loudly, but completely. Shame came first. Shame for every moment I had allowed the idea of being chosen to live in the quiet corners of my heart. Shame for the way I'd smiled at his attention. Shame for the nights I had driven home replaying his words as if they were more than professional kindness. Then came the anger, anger at him for treating two women like parallel stories he could edit at will. anger at the version of myself that had almost believed I was the exception. Claire did not rush me. She simply sat there while I read, while I processed, while the carefully ordered world I had built around my job and my careful boundaries collapsed in slow motion. In the weeks that followed, Richard recovered. The police called it a domestic incident. No charges were pressed because Claire refused to press them. He tried to reach me, calls, messages, a handwritten note left on my desk that I never opened. I requested a transfer within the company. It was granted without question. Even in weakness, his influence still moved pieces on the board. The nights were the hardest. I would lie awake in the dark and replay every conversation, every almost confession, every time I felt seen by him. The loneliness that followed was different from ordinary loneliness. It was the loneliness of realizing the person who made you feel special had never been telling you the full truth and that you had participated in the illusion by wanting it to be true. Claire and I began meeting more often, not as friends at first, as two women standing in the same wreckage. We met in bookshops where the smell of paper felt safer than the smell of offices. We walked in early morning parks when the city was still quiet. We sat in the back corner of a late-night cafe and spoke in low voices about the years we had each spent performing. She told me about the polished dinners, the empty bedrooms, the way Richard's public devotion had always been louder than his private presence. I told her about the late nights, the quiet praise, the dangerous comfort of feeling chosen by someone who already belonged to someone else. Together, we began to see the full shape of what he had done. He had not only been unfaithful in intention, he had built an entire life on carefully managed versions of the truth, one version for the boardroom, one for the wife who kept the image perfect, one for the younger woman who made him feel alive again. Then Claire brought the second folder. This one was thicker. Inside were records of money moved through shell companies, contracts signed under quiet pressure, former colleagues who had left under circumstances that never quite added up. Richard's empire had been built on more than ambition. It had been built on silence and fear. He was preparing to walk away from the risks, Claire said one evening, her voice steady but tired. Leave me holding the company, the legal exposure, the public face of everything he had done. You were supposed to be the clean start, the proof that he could still be the hero of his own story. I stared at the papers until the words blurred. The man I had almost fallen for was not only a liar about love. He was a man who treated people as movable pieces. That night, something shifted inside me. The heartbreak did not disappear. It simply stopped being the only thing I felt. Underneath it, a colder, clearer strength began to form. I was no longer the woman waiting for an explanation or an apology. I was the woman who had seen the full architecture of the betrayal and decided she would not remain small inside it. Claire looked at me across the table, her eyes reflecting the same quiet resolve. I cannot do this alone, she said, but I will not destroy myself just to free us. I need someone who understands what he took and what he still believes he owns. I closed the folder. My hands were steady now. Then we do it carefully, I answered. And we do it completely. But the path forward was not simple. Richard was still powerful. Even weakened, he had allies. One afternoon, a quiet warning arrived on my desk, an anonymous note that simply read, "Some doors are better left closed." A few days later, my apartment, building's security camera on the second floor, stopped working for exactly 47 minutes. Nothing was taken. Nothing was disturbed. The message was clear enough. Claire received her own version, a delivery of white flowers with no card, left on her doorstep the same day Richard was discharged from the hospital. We did not scare easily. We simply became more careful. We met in different places each time. We used encrypted notes. We spoke only in person about the most sensitive pieces. Slowly, the evidence grew. Former employees who had once been too afraid to speak began to find their voices once they realized they were no longer standing alone. A junior accountant who had been pressured into silence years earlier finally agreed to talk. A former board member who had resigned under mysterious circumstances handed over a single external hard drive with a quiet, exhausted expression. Every new piece of information made the picture clearer and darker. Richard had not only been preparing to leave Claire, he had been preparing to leave the legal risks behind while keeping the rewards. The clean start he had imagined with me was never about love. It was about escape. The realization cut deeper than any of the messages. I had not been the exception. I had been the exit strategy. That knowledge hardened something inside me. The shame did not vanish, but it stopped controlling me. The anger stopped being chaotic and became focused. One evening, after another quiet meeting, Claire looked at me across the table and said the words that changed the temperature of everything. He still thinks he can manage this. He still thinks both of us will eventually fold back into the story he prefers. We are going to show him that the story is over. I nodded. For the first time since the night of the phone call, I felt something close to calm. Not peace yet, but direction. Asterisk, we moved the way winter moves, slowly, thoroughly, without spectacle. No public confrontations. No dramatic scenes in the office hallway. Just patient collection of evidence, quiet conversations with people who had once been too afraid to speak, and the careful delivery of truth to the places where it could no longer be ignored. Anonymous packages reached the board. Detailed timelines reached the right regulators. Former colleagues who had carried silent stories for years found the courage to add their voices once they realized they were no longer standing alone. Richard tried one last time to reach me. The call came late at night from a private number. His voice was softer than I had ever heard. It stripped of the boardroom authority, stripped of the careful charm. I never meant for any of this to touch you, he said. You were the only clean thing left in my life. I listened until the silence after his words felt complete. Then I answered, calm and clear. I was never a thing, and I was never yours to keep clean. I ended the call. The consequences arrived without drama and without mercy. Investigations opened. Accounts were frozen. Public statements were issued. The carefully constructed empire began to fold in on itself under the weight of everything he had tried to keep hidden. Claire filed for divorce on her own terms. She kept the house on the hill. She kept her name. She kept the quiet dignity that no scandal could take from her. I kept my position in the new department, far from his remaining influence. More importantly, I kept the version of myself that no longer needed his gaze to feel valuable. There was one final confrontation I did not expect. 2 months after the investigations became public, Richard found a way to meet me in a quiet park near the river. He looked smaller somehow, still polished, still carefully dressed, but the power that used to sit around him like a second coat was gone. I love the idea of you, he said without preamble. That has to count for something. I looked at him for a long moment. The man who had once made late nights feel like something warmer. The man whose almost confessions I had carried like fragile glass. It counts as a warning, I answered. Not a reason. He started to speak again. I did not stay to hear it. I walked away while he was still standing there, and the river kept moving beside me as if nothing important had just ended. Months later, Claire invited me back to the house. We sat on the wide porch as the evening light turned the sky the soft color of healing bruises. The city stretched below us, ordinary and alive. No folders this time. No evidence. Just 2 cups of tea and the kind of silence that no longer needed to be filled. I used to believe that being chosen was the highest form of love, I told her. Now I know the highest thing is the truth you refuse to abandon, even when it costs you the story you wanted to believe. Claire nodded slowly, and the peace that comes when you finally stop performing for someone else's version of who you should be. We did not toast. We simply sat there as the light faded. Two women who had walked through the same fire and come out carrying different scars, but the same clear-eyed strength. I drove home that night with the windows down. The cool air moved across my face like a quiet acknowledgement. The phone call that started everything, "Get here in 10 minutes," or "He won't survive," had been about a man bleeding on a living room floor. But the real survival had belonged to the two women he had underestimated. We survived the carefully constructed lies. We survived the almost love that was never honest. We survived the versions of ourselves that had once waited to be chosen. And in the end, the only revenge that mattered was this. We walked away whole. We built lives that no longer required his shadow to feel complete. If there is a moral worth carrying, it is simple and hard and true. Never let another person's hunger for you become the measure of your worth. Never stay inside a story that demands you remain small so someone else can feel large-jawed. And when the truth finally arrives messy, painful, and complete, choose the version of yourself that can look at it without looking away. The night Claire called, I thought I was rushing to save a life. I was. It just wasn't his. It was ours.